Right. Welcome, everyone, to our first webinar for 2026 for the Australian Council of Graduate Research. My name's Tracy Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of ACGR, and we're really excited to kick off our webinar series this year looking at wellbeing support in high degree research, such an important topic as the pressures on our sector are ever increasing. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from today, the Darug people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their enduring custodianship of the land that I'm fortunate to live and work on. I'd also like to extend that respect and acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands that you're joining us from today. We're very, very fortunate today to have Dr. Narelle Lemon with us. Narelle is a professor and Vice-Chancellor Professorial Research Fellow at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Australia, where she bridges the gap between wellbeing and science and everyday practice. With a Bachelor of Music, Master of Applied Positive Psychology and Doctorate in Education from the University of Melbourne, she has dedicated her career to making wellbeing research accessible and actionable for educators, students and communities. As a prolific author, Narelle has written over 15 books and serves as series editor for Routledge's Wellbeing and Self-Care in Higher Education collection and the International Journal of Applied Positive Psychology. Her work transforms complex wellbeing science into practical strategies that people can implement in their daily lives, whether in classrooms, universities or communities. Narelle co-founded the Whisper Collective as the Wellbeing Whispers with Thesis Whisperer and Research Whisperer. We know those well. They collaborate with writing partners who created the global Shut Up and Write movement, fostering supportive academic writing communities worldwide. Her international experience includes visiting scholar positions at institutions across the UK, including connections with the University of Cambridge, as well as universities in New Zealand, Canada and Malaysia. She's the creator and host of multiple influential podcasts, including Teachers Supporting Teachers, with 65 plus episodes reaching global audiences, and She Speaks, featuring a growing podcast with over 20 episodes that translates wellbeing research into practical everyday applications for women. The Citizen Wellbeing Scientist Initiative offers workshops and resources specifically designed for women's self-care, featuring a growing podcast with over 20 episodes that translates wellbeing research into practical everyday applications. Combining expertise in arts, education, positive psychology and mindfulness with a gift for translating research into practice, Narelle empowers individuals and communities to prioritise their wellbeing. Her work spans internationally sharing innovative approaches to building wellbeing literacy and fostering human flourishing in educational and community settings. Narelle believes that self-care is not selfish but essential and a foundation for sustainable engagement with the world and others. So I'll now hand over to Narelle, who is going to lead us through this webinar and this conversation today. Thank you, Narelle.
Thanks, Tracy, and lovely to be here with you all. I'm just checking that you are seeing the slides. Beautiful, and not behind the scenes. Welcome. So welcome to this session here today. We're talking about supervisors who support, and we're thinking about wellbeing and self-care. There we go. Sound check. Hello, welcome. All working now. We had the technology thing of unmuting. Okay, there we go. Lovely to be with you all. Today we're talking about supervisors who support. We're thinking about wellbeing from the supervision perspective, but also with our candidates as well. I'm aiming to talk perhaps for about 20 to 30 minutes and then open it up for conversations and engagement as well, because I think this is a really lovely hot topic and one where opening up those perspectives and sharing and thoughts is a really, really meaningful. So before I do so, I wanted to just acknowledge that I'm joining you from Wujat Noongar Budja in Perth here. And I wanted to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that the work of wellbeing and tendering ourselves has been practiced on this country for tens of thousands of years and by deep knowledge holders and long researchers in their own kind. So I'm a continual learner, as you are as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge what being on country brings to us as we grow, consider, and talk about wellbeing. So this session has come from the basis of a book chapter that sits in the volume 2 of the Confident Supervisors, Creating Independent Researchers, and a wonderful volume that complements 2 volumes now, edited by a wonderful team of Susan, Gillian, Abby and Christine. And I had the privilege of writing chapter 15 in volume 2, which talked about supervisor wellbeing. And kind of this is the underpinning of this presentation today. This volume is available online. It is free, so you can go and have a search for that. And we can share the link after this webinar as well for easy access. So I'm going to invite you to join in the chat just now and think of a supervisor or perhaps a colleague who supported your wellbeing, even without naming it that way. What did they do? I wonder if you could share one word or a couple of words in the chat. Listened, empathized, acknowledged, safety, asked. Yeah, beautiful. Lots of listens. Didn't judge, met regularly, open door policy, empathy, food, constructive feedback. Tolerate, clear guidance, ask, what do you need from me? Yeah, beautiful. Caring. Yeah, really nice. A lovely set of words coming through there, and I invite you to keep on sharing those as we work through. So as we think about wellbeing in higher education, particularly around the PhD Masters by Research space, you know, the terrain is quite strong here. So higher education research is both one of the most intellectually rewarding things a person can do and one of the loneliest. So the timelines are long, the work is independent in a way that can tip into isolation. The stakes are high and they feel personal in a way that coursework simply does not ignite. We have good data on this now, and we've seen quite a lot of research come out that's really thinking about the psychological distress is one of the most significant predictors of non-completion. And we also see research that's talking about the PhD candidates are at risk of developing or have developed a common psychological disorder, anxiety, distress that can sit there. And it might sit there in small numbers, but actually when we look collectively and we start to look at the reports that are coming through, those numbers are quite bigger than what was first predicted. And the evidence is consistent on one point that the supervisor-candidate relationship is the most single influential variable shaping not just completion, but the experience itself. And what I started to think about is thinking about how do we build a mindful language, a mindful intentional language, or what we start to call now is that wellbeing literacy. So that capability and capacity to talk about wellbeing for self and for others, and to build that capacity to be able to label, to understand, and to grow and with each other. And so what's really important here is with wellbeing literacy is that when we're thinking about this in the candidate supervision relationship, we're all adults and we're working with each other as adults, even though there is a power dynamic in terms of the supervisors, knowing the context of university, knowing the context of milestones, language, methodology, all those sorts of aspects. But a candidate is also an adult. So when we start to think about a wellbeing literacy, there's a bit of a paradox sitting here in that a candidate may have wonderful wellbeing literacy, be able to communicate what is happening for them in regards to their wellbeing. And that may be coming to a supervisor or a team of supervisors who will not be as wellbeing literate, and also vice versa. But then we also have a combination of the supervisory team and a candidate also having great wellbeing literacy, and all of them having a really great wellbeing literacy that can grow and go on a journey together much quicker than when there's those tensions of either or situation. So what's important with wellbeing literacy, and it differs from a health literacy or a mental health literacy. So health literacy is about managing the physical health. Mental health literacy is about recognizing and responding to mental illness. Wellbeing literacy sits at the flourishing end of that continuum. And it's about the language we use when things are going reasonably well and when we want to stay that well. And how do we help someone stay well as they go through the candidature? Also, how do we help our supervisors stay well when we're also supporting candidates perhaps who are at that struggling continuum end where we kind of want to shift them? So underpinning wellbeing literacy has 5 components, and I'm just going to quickly delve through this. And if you wanted to read more about it, you can do so in the chapter. But what we want to do is just have a look at these layers here that start to think about, do I have a vocabulary? Can I comprehend wellbeing language? Can I compose it? So speak it, write it, perform it? Because wellbeing literacy is not just written or verbal text, it's multimodal as well. Am I aware about the context and how that shifts meaning? And finally, am I intentional about it? And thinking about this also is you could be well and have a great wellbeing literacy in a particular context with a particular combination of people, but you change that context or you change the people, even a variable of one person, and the wellbeing literacy of that group can change as well. So we might have, if you've got a panel or a lab of multiple supervisors, a candidate might have a great wellbeing literacy with one of those supervisors one-on-one, but as a group that may change as well, depending on that context and what has been set up. And vice versa, there might be great wellbeing literacy as the full team, but then when the candidate moves to any kind of relationship where it's one-on-one or a combination of less than the greater of the team, that intentional language may change again. So when I start to think about building a wellbeing literacy, I think about it from a toolbox approach. And the reason I do this is because we need diverse areas of wellbeing science to help us be well, to be proactive in our development, our maintaining, our growth and protection of our wellness, health and well-being. And a toolbox metaphor is really great to be able to start to think about that wellbeing science, in that we need different areas of wellbeing science. For example, we need different tools in order to support our wellbeing, and that not one single tool solves the problem, but we might have one tool that we go to a lot, so it's very well used, or we might have multiple versions of that different tool. So, for example, we might have multiple versions of a hammer that do different things. One's a soft mallet, one's, a little bit, it's a bigger size, one's one of those tiny mini baby sized. And then we start to think through, if one's well used and then there's others who are not used so well, what does that mean? And is there an imbalance there? But can that change? You might have a tool in your toolbox that you've collected along the way, but you haven't had a chance to use it just yet. But something in the future will go, that tool's there. I might pick that up and change it. And also we might drop a tool as well. And what it is that we just start to build up what that is. And wellbeing science can help us label our tools through all sorts of different structures that might sit there. But I'm not going to go into detail into that. What I wanted to start to move through is that I think about self-care as an intentional language that we can build our wellbeing literacy. So self-care as a term where we're caring for self in order to care for others, that it's relational, and that it comes to our proactive action to support our well-being, wellness, and health. So if the self-care is an intentional language and that we're caring for self in order to care for others, we're also exploring our toolbox of tools in regards to other people being motivation, inspiration, support, accountability buddies, even acts of self-care. And particularly when we think about the candidate and the higher degree candidate and the supervisors, that relationship is one of the most important relationships to support success. What does that mean in the relationality of the self? And self as self-compassion, self-awareness, self-regulation that enables that care for self, but also care for each other and backwards and forwards. And this is for the supervisor and the candidate as well. Supervisors also need to be caring for their self in order to care for others and the candidate as well. And so I start to think about this in terms of 5 dimensions. And I've created a model where I think about self-compassion, mindful awareness, time, habits, and empowerment as intersecting dimensions. Not one has a hierarchy. Not one can happen first. I've labeled them here 1, 2, 2, 5, just as a way to say there's 5. But you could reorder this in any way. And some come paired together as well. So what does this look like when we start to think about it in regards to the higher degree research candidate and the supervision relationships? So self-compassion is one of those really interesting notions where we start to think about kindness, common humanity, judgment. But one of the ways I frame this is self-compassion's like, how do you treat yourself like a friend? So as the candidate and you as supervisors thinking through, well, how do you actually individually treat yourself as a friend when we start to think about for well-being and our self-care? Because if we think about it, if a dear friend comes to us and shares that they're distressed, they're upset, we would be very encouraging. We would be soothing with our language, our tone. We would select words that are quite helpful, supportive. We would spend time, like what you shared in the chat earlier. You would listen. There would be empathy. You would ask questions about how I can support. So all of that is, that notion of treating others, that compassion of treating a friend. So if we start to flip it to self-compassion, it's the same aspect. How do you share? How do you be with yourself? How do you, in a dialogue, talk with yourself? How do you act and behave with others that shows a self-compassion, that you're treating yourself like a friend? So we're starting to think about this in regards to perhaps as researchers thinking about, recognizing imposter syndrome as common, not personal. This self-compassion aspect has a common humanity. You are not alone. And often we feel we're alone, and particularly when we're processing our well-being, but you are not alone in those common aspects that pop through in terms of fear of feedback, processing in regards to perfectionism, imposter syndrome, all those kinds of aspects, setbacks. And for supervisors, we also start to think, well, how can we hold that self-compassion space for ourselves, but also for our candidates? And thinking, about normalizing the struggle. There are ups and downs in the PhD, Masters by Research journey. That we frame criticism is about the work, not about the person. That actually criticism is about that growth, and we need that healthy balance as well with the feedback. And this might not sound like rocket science, but the amount of candidates I speak to who find seeking feedback back that feels personal, or the tone of it, or it's lacking any kind of, I really like this sentence, or you're starting to get the ideas here, but we just need to push this a bit forward. How we use that language is sometimes forgotten about and not presented in a way that holds that compassion or support someone who is thinking about that self-compassion aspect. And the other thing that I encourage and talk about is how do we as supervisors model self-compassionate responses aloud, and talking about that through those discussions with our candidates, but with each other as well. The other second dimension that I'm going to talk about today, and remembering that it's not hierarchical in order, it's just the order I'm presenting it now, is about mindful awareness. And this is not sitting, with that notion of mindfulness, but it's sitting with that aspect of mindful awareness in terms of tuning into being present right now, noticing without judgment. And this is the self as supervisors, but also as our candidates, as our emerging researchers. So we're catching those early signs of burnout. We're thinking about how we pay attention without rushing to fix or to judge. And then this is the dimension that starts to think us about catching those early stress signs. And before it becomes, something like burnout, we're starting to think about, okay, what are those signs that are emerging there that are showing that our candidates are struggling a little bit at the moment, and where do we need to step back or to flip or to rethink? And in supervision, mindful awareness is that practice of being actually present in the meeting. Present with phones down, laptops, screens shut, actually probably away from the desk with the computer, and being present with that candidate in that moment, in that room. It's about helping setting up research rhythms. And then we need to support our candidates with those rhythms, with notions of what it means to be scholars. And then thinking through, notice when something like perfectionism, if I can speak, starts to come through. How do we start to talk about this in a way that is from an awareness, non-judgment space? And so for those for the supervisors, we're thinking about, checking in on wellbeing, not just about the progress of the work, and of course, building that language. And you don't need to use the word wellbeing as a check-in, but finding what is that intentional language as a team that you're using. What are those non-verbal cues that you're using in terms of eye contact, being present, not multitasking? Communicating really clearly in regards to feedback that talks about the positives and also the growth areas. I want to talk about time as a dimension, and this one's really interesting because time as a dimension, most supervisors tell us they struggle with their own and then their candidates. So it's not only about time management and from that productivity sense, but it's about that relationship we have with time. So time poor, time rich, focus time, recovery time, micro moments, that long arc of a thesis. We're starting to talk about things in terms of realistic. We have always, with our candidates, key milestones and pressure points in regards to time of how long you have as a candidate, but also how do you break that down and how does that come through in a way that's beyond just a Gantt chart? How do we come about it in terms of an embodiedness of time, and what does that look like? And then we have habits. And so I start to think about this in regards to short, sharp actions that you take that when repeated over time become a habit. And so habits are the unglamorous dimension here of self-care in our entry point into well-being, wellness and health. And the consistent, they're the consistent writing routine, the regular sleep, the Friday afternoon reflection, the walk before the meeting. The habits are boring, but habits are what carry us through. And they're one of the most important aspects in terms of supporting our candidates, but also us as supervisors in terms of what are our patterns, what are our routines in terms of modelling agendas, meetings, being present within meetings, response to feedback, the style of feedback, mentoring and modelling in terms of conference presentations, writing abstracts, networking, engagement, all those kinds of aspects. and sitting that through there. And the big important thing is that we as researchers generally and supervisors generally have great habits, but what does that look like in regards to the supervision relationship, and what do they look like? But when do we establish them? And it's not just those beginning moments when we first come together and decide how we're going to work together, but it's all the way through at different pressure points that occurs for our candidates, and thinking through, when do we need to tweak, when do we need to add on more, what might that look like? And the fifth dimension here is empowerment. And I see this in really strongly connected to agency and choice. So wellbeing is something we shape, not something that happens to us. And so empowerment is that dimension that turns wellbeing from passive to active. So it's the candidate's sense that they will have agency over their research. I always talk about, what's the joy to your topic? Why does this bring you joy? What is that excitement, that spark that sits there? Because you want to have that even through those ups and downs. That what can bring you when you're in a down back to that why of this work, the meaning of this work, the joy that is there. And it's the supervisor's willingness to transfer this agency bit by bit as the candidate grows. So we're thinking through, those decision-making, boundaries, choice, building networks, ownership, accountability, creating all those opportunities that are kind of modeled and paired really nicely with that awareness piece and that the self-compassion piece, and also those habits of how we form and what that is and feels like. So I'm going to ask you, I've just talked a lot just then, and I've kind of done a very high overview of the 5 dimensions of self-care that I think about the how of that self-care as our term to enter into well-being, wellness and health. So which dimension is calling you right now? And I wonder if you could just pop a little note in the chat there. Nice. Time is resonating a lot. Habits, awareness. Thanks, Piers. You'll have the recording. Thanks for joining us at the start. Nice. What I love about this in the chat is that it just shows how the dimensions resonate in different ways. And it reinforces that not one is more important than the other, that each will resonate for different reasons with us. And if you share this with your candidates as well, different will resonate with them. And as a collective, differences will resonate as well. And so that means there can be different starting points and connection points in there. But what it does is start to bring, this is a how, but it actually starts to bring that intentional language that helps you build a wellbeing literacy, helps you to attend to what does this look like within the partnership and that relationship of supervision and working with our candidates. And we all know that wellbeing is incredibly complex. There's not one answer. So what this offers is a model to potentially support those dialogues, to potentially support what might be possible to extend those conversations with each other and to build that context, to embody, to integrate wellbeing and self-care as a part of the process, not as a add-on or something that is addressed or discussed at that part of the continuum where we're sitting at languishing. So, we can start to think about what you might be drawn to in terms of entry points that might come into here. So we're thinking, you might think about structure. And so you might start with habits or time. You might think about self-criticism and thinking what that might sit through. Sometimes we work with candidates who are very, very hard on themselves, So self-compassion might be that space. How do you treat yourself as a friend, and framing that through. Overwhelm is a big thing, particularly coming through that confirmation stage, but also I notice it often comes up towards that I'm nearly to the final draft, coming into submission stage. Overwhelm might start to be an entry in terms of that mindful awareness. And feeling constrained can sit there too. And what does empowerment look like when we start to think about that through? So there's no order. It's all different ways. It's all different different starting points. You can also pair or cluster these dimensions together as well. So here are 5 conversation starters that might be beneficial to you. And yes, we're going to share the slides after this workshop as well, and you'll have the recording. So don't stress if you're going to madly write, but there might be one you might pick just now as a conversation starter that might be relevant for one of your candidates who you're working with at the moment. And so you might, from a self-compassion perspective, say research has its ups and downs for everyone. How are you responding when things don't go as planned? I love this question and as a starting point, because I use this as a beautiful check-in moment, because we're really good at the start of a candidate relationship talking about how do we respond to feedback, what are our trigger points, what do you want from me as a supervisor, this is what I want from you as a candidate. But we are really great at slipping through and not doing those regular check-ins. And I love this question as a regular check-in, sort of a quarterly check-ins, just to think through, well, what is that looking for at the moment? And what do we need to tweak? What have we noticed that's working well? What do we need to start to change a little bit? Mindful awareness gives us a beautiful check-in conversation starter with what parts of your research are you finding most engaging right now? And what does your attention go? Where does your attention go naturally? This is a great one for those candidates who get really hyper-fixed into one kind of way of working or one focus area of their thesis, and they forget about those other aspects. So I've used this as a beautiful check-in with my candidates who get really focused in on literature, and they go down a rabbit warren in terms of areas that is not relevant. We only need to sort of bookmark to say this is important, but it's not a part of this focus of the research. And so we use this beautiful question just to come back in and to go, where are we sitting at the moment? Time, how's the pacing feel? Are there parts that feel rushed or places you feel stuck? Is a beautiful check-in piece. Habits, what routines are actually supporting you at the moment? Anything you'd like to change? I use this one particularly when a candidate comes to me and is expressing overwhelm or distress in terms of there's so many things, I'm feeling disorganized. And so this is a great way to talk through routines, what's happening at the moment, usually acknowledgement of what things have been dropped. And then we can start to put a plan in together of all of those things that are dropped. Will they continue to be dropped? Will they be replaced? Do they need to be picked up? What sort of other tweaks need to happen? And empowerment is where do you feel you have the most agency in your research right now? And thinking through, anything you'd like more. So these are beautiful sentence starters as a way to come through and connect in beautiful entry points that hopefully you as supervisors feel comfortable with as well. And it's got that a safety removal. You've got your shield, but you're also connecting in a way that's supporting that candidate and how they move forward. This is another strategy that I think is really lovely, and I talk about in the chapter as well in terms of a wellbeing check-in. And this is kind of a scaffold that might help you and connects really beautifully with a lot of those aspects that you shared in our first chat at the start of this time together. So acknowledge that wellbeing matters to the work, ask an open question, Listen fully, not leaping to fix. Respond by validating what you've heard. Support with a resource if genuinely needed. Transition gently into the research talk. And so there's acknowledgement there, but then you're transitioning through in a way that's really supportive. It's not something that's required, a model that's required for every meeting, but it's a nice model, particularly if you're starting to sense or you have observed or the candidate is starting to express. And particularly that support aspect is really critical there, because that is your then wellbeing literacy kind of leverage to then make sure that the professional support teams are accessed, and particularly those that we have within our university higher education settings, and that candidate knows where they are, and that they are there to support, and there's no judgment in terms of taking that support up. It's also positioning you in terms of the awareness around wellbeing, but also you are not the only solution in supporting our candidates, particularly when we're moving down to that continuum, away from the flourishing right down to that languishing, and the languishing might sit there for too long. So I'm going to share with you on the screen now a matrix, and I know for many of you who are on laptops, you're going, what the? We will share this out as a PDF, but what I've done is started to put the how of self-care and through across some scenarios that are really quite common in the high degree research scenario. So overwhelm, communication challenges, perfectionism, writing blocks, isolation or low confidence. And we'll share this out with you, but I'm going to drill down into a couple and make them a bit bigger so your eyes don't explode in terms of that size. So in the grid here, we've talked about self-compassion, and I'm talking about here in terms of suggestions of strategies for overwhelm and communication challenges. So I'm proposing you could use self-compassion as a dimension to come into talking about overwhelm, and normalizing that emotional load of research and reminding our candidates that feeling overwhelmed is a common, complex aspect in terms of projects. From the supervisor actions, we're validating the emotions before problem solving. And from that toolbox scenario, what is a tool that draws on a different aspect of wellbeing science? What might that look like in overwhelm? It could be, what would you say to a colleague in this situation as a reflection? So you're enabling and giving those different language points to support overwhelm, underpinned by that dimension of self-compassion. We think of self-compassion coming towards a situation of communication challenges. Quite often our candidates go silent and missing in action, even though we've reached out quite regularly. Meetings can get cancelled. There can be no replacement meetings or things coming through. I like my candidates to book the meetings, but we have a regular pattern. But if I start to see communication challenges, I start from a self-compassion space and go encourage kindness towards ourselves when conversations feel difficult or unclear. So that's holding it for me, but also you're holding that space for your candidate. So your supervision actions are like model respectful and open communication. Just reaching out and saying, it's been a number of weeks, I haven't heard from you. I'm a bit worried. What's happening? How can I support you? If we're worried about writing coming through and the writing's not flowing, let's check in and have a go and see what's happening for you. And maybe we could do a co-writing, co-share session there to see how things are happening. And so we were using that toolbox in terms of reflecting on intentions before responding to the feedback. So you're coming back through to that behaviour rather than going towards that action, which is the feedback that might be blocking what's occurring. And I'll share one more for us. So if you think about the scenario of perfectionism and how mindful awareness as a dimension may support us. So we're noticing when perfectionist thinking appears. For the supervisor, we're inviting reflection on expectations versus reality. And for our toolbox, we're thought noticing. So what story am I telling myself? If we're thinking about the action of writing blocks, which is a nice one that often appears with our candidates and ourselves as well, mindful awareness is a dimension that observes thoughts that interrupt flow, the writing of flow, the flow of writing rather. For the supervisor, the actions are sitting around encouraging, noticing when writing anxiety arises. And our toolbox is observe that inner dialogue during those writing sessions. And so we can start to use that, okay, that intentional language of what the candidate is sharing with us as we might move that forward. And another scenario is isolation or that low confidence. And I know they're two separate things, but sometimes they are connected as well. And so from the dimension of mindful awareness, we're helping our students notice comparison patterns with peers. For supervisor actions, we might be asking what situations trigger those feelings of disconnection. And in terms of our toolbox activity, we're thinking perhaps about how journaling a prompt about the emotions in research might actually support. So these are not only one answer, these are just suggestions of how we can enter this way of thinking and support that way, particularly applying the how, these dimensions, as we build our toolbox, our strategies that come along. So before we go into question and answer time, I'm going to ask you and invite you to pick one dimension, a conversation starter, something that's relevant this week with one of your candidates, and start to think about what you might put into practice this week and what might that look like. And I'd invite any sharing in the chat here, just so we help each other in this space together build our wellbeing literacy. So I'm going to set the intention this week that I am using habits as a dimension, and I'm going to do this with a candidate who's struggling to meet deadlines, but particularly how they navigate their week. And they've got they're about to submit. And so we've got a bit of a stress going on. It's feeling a little bit different. So we're going to be using the dimension of habits to start to think through what needs to be done. What does that look like? And how do we think that through into the energy of the day and then the energy of the week? We're particularly thinking this through in terms of, when does fresh new writing happen? When does editing happening? When does reading happening? When is put that away and celebrate that win? And so what is that flow each day? What are those habits, those rituals that enable that to occur? I like this, Libby. Mindful awareness to help with a conversation about burnout. Yeah, really nice. Thank you for sharing that. So as we come to the end and as people are still typing and coming through, Judith put habits, what routines are actually supporting you. Yeah, that's really nice. And I like that term and the intentional use of the language of actually supporting you versus doing for the sake of it, but are they actions that support? So that's really nice. I also start to think through, us as supervisors also need tending to. And so thinking about this work in terms of us as individuals, as scholars as well, is an invitation. We're all working in a context that is forever changing. And so, we are supporting a lot of other people, but how does that also come back onto you as well? And we'll share last one that Braden said, habit to set times for managing your meeting targets while juggling other commitments, for example, parenting, cultural responsibilities. That's a beautiful intention that's been set there. Lovely. So I'm going to invite any questions, reflections, pushback. And we can either, I think, Tracy, shall we invite people to either share in the chat or to share, put their hand up and share over mic? And I'll stop sharing my screen so then I can see as well.
Definitely. Thank you, Narelle. I think we already have a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, fabulous.
We have one from Judith, feeling stressed about timelines being rigid and implications for your own record of supervision. Is this the contextual part of wellbeing that is sort of out of control? I wonder what your reflection on this is.
Mm.
Can I just jump in to clarify? That being the university context is sort of out of our control. So I think I like all this, it's obviously individual agency to support your well-being, but recognizing that many of the stresses are outside of our control or are influenced by that. I just wondered what your reflection was on that.
There we go. I was about to talk and I realized I was muted. I think this is a really great question. And this is where I encourage the dimension of empowerment choice to come back into it as well. And I talk very openly about there's things that we can't control. They're out of our control. For example, with candidature, there's timelines, there's particular policies and processes. So where the empowerment comes back into is to go, okay, this is the scenario. Can we spend some time together talking this through? And where do I have the choice and empowerment as I navigate it, both as supervisors, but then also candidates? And it's more than just doing like the Gantt chart or the research planning. It's actually talking through those pressure points where it's like actually labeling it and going, wow, I've got to go to candidature within 3 months of a full time. What does that mean? That's highly pressurized, particularly for a candidate who's still conceptualizing all those submission pressure points. So I think it's really, important to have those conversations to label it and acknowledge it as well. So, and it's okay to say that this is stressful, but where's my choice and agency in how we manage what feels like and is non-negotiable timelines? I hope that helps.
We also had a question from Laura, and Laura, please speak up if I'm not interpreting this correctly. So would you recommend having these conversations more so when you might be meeting with a student one-on-one, or is it also okay when you're meeting with more than one supervisor? They commonly have 3 supervisors on the supervision team. So would students feel more comfortable in a one-on-one setting for these?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I would put this down to making a decision based on the people involved and checking in with the candidate as well. I think one of the beautiful aspects of having multiple supervisors is each supervisor brings something different in terms of their specializations, in terms of methodology, knowledge, how long they've been supervising, all those sorts of aspects. But I think this also comes to have to acknowledge that each supervisor is different in their wellbeing literacy and their emotional capacity. So having perhaps a discussion as the supervision team of where you want to sit with this, what is one-on-one, what is whole group conversations, and really navigating that. And I think also the candidate will naturally start to identify the supervisor that they feel like they can go to, as well as when they start to talk about their wellbeing as well. So there's that flexibility. But I would definitely not, I would not recommend that it's an expectation that these conversations occur as a whole group, but it may, depending on the combination. I know for me, I work with multiple different groups of supervision. There are some teams where we have these conversations all together because we set that up from the beginning and that works for the candidate. But there's other combinations of supervisors that you know, I'm generally the one that holds that load because they don't feel comfortable in that. And you also want to start to think about that mutual respect. We're working with adults as well. So some of these conversations are not always something that needs to be commonly known. And there's that relationship with the candidate as well as of what that looks like. So my simple answer is it's always going to be different, but there's a lot of, you know, there's some of those variables there that I've talked through. There are more as well, but yeah, just be careful not to make an assumption that what is right for one candidate is right for each candidate or combination of supervisors as well.
We had another question from Louise, wanting to explain further around checking in with students and offering to do a write together time. What this looks like.
Yeah. So if a student is struggling with writing flow, or there's a bit of fear of getting words on the page, I love to do a little write together session. And sometimes I'll do this that it's not on the specific topic of what the thesis is. It might be something else, but just as a modeling of, I call it blah writing, where you just type, you just write just for the sake of it. It doesn't matter if you repeat yourself 6 times in different ways. It doesn't matter if there's spelling mistakes. It doesn't matter if you're writing and you go, oh, what's that? What's that word? And you just put a little star or something. But that blah writing, but doing it together and then bouncing off. And so we might set a timer and go, hey, let's just blah write for 20 minutes. We're both doing it. And then they will talk through that process. And then I'll talk through what I'll do next with mine to craft. And then we'll try that together. And so we might do it on my piece and then we might do it on their piece. So it's just this time together where it's almost scaffolding how to write and thinking through that genre of writing as well, but in a way that is modeling it beyond, I guess it's the experiential modeling it. It's complementary to, hey, have a look at this writing, or hey, have a look at these drafts, and then the track changes and how that was going. So it's just another way of thinking that through, writing together. And there's no judgment, and you're also like I in this scenario are also showing my vulnerability, as when I blah write, I really do say the same things in 6 different ways. And it takes me a while to get to that succinct sentence. So it's just, showing that experience. I hope that makes sense. Any other thoughts, questions? No, I think we might be sitting all okay. Lots of content that's just been shared at you in different thinking. So we will share a copy of the slides, and we'll also share that matrix, which is just a beginning of thinking it through. And you're more than welcome to reach out at any stage as well.
One last round. Are there any final questions or thoughts? Got some wonderful feedback there in the chat, Narelle. Very, very useful session. And I think having a toolkit and a framework for having these conversations in a structured way is really meaningful and helpful. So thank you so much for your time and your expertise today. As Narelle mentioned, we've recorded this session, so this will go up on the ACGR website, and we'll also make available the PDFs for you. And I believe they will also have Narelle's contact details if you'd like to reach out and engage with her further. So on behalf of ACGR, thank you all for coming here today during your lunchtime, and thank you very much, Narelle, for sharing the toolkit with us.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, everyone.